4:22 a.m. The Korean Peninsula, 38th parallel north. The mountain tunnel had been excavated over a period of 11 years. Its entrance was concealed behind a standard agricultural structure that had appeared on commercial satellite imagery since 2009, without triggering a targeting classification. The tunnel interior ran 340 meters into the granite, branching at 3 points into separate bays, each bay housing 2 Hwasong 7 mobile launchers on rail-mounted platforms that allowed the vehicles to roll to a firing position outside the tunnel entrance within 4 minutes of receiving a launch order. The entire complex had been designed around one operational principle: that the gap between a launcher exiting a tunnel and completing its firing sequence was too short for any preemptive engagement to close. At 4:22 a.m., the tunnel doors at 17 separate complexes along the 38th parallel region opened simultaneously. The Korean People's Army Strategic Rocket Forces had received their launch authorization at 4:19 a.m., transmitted through a redundant hardened communications network that included fiber optic buried cable, ELF radio relay, and physical messenger courier running in parallel. 3 systems designed on the assumption that any one of the 3 could be severed without interrupting the authorization chain. The authorization had traveled through all 3 simultaneously. It had arrived at every launch complex within 90 seconds. By 4:38 a.m., 412 weapons were in flight. The breakdown: 218 Hwasong 7 ballistic missiles with ranges between 700 and 1,000 kilometers, targeting US and Republic of Korea military installations across the peninsula. Camp Humphreys, Osan Air Base, Kunsan Air Base, the ROK Army Headquarters Complex at Gyeongdae, and 14 additional military facilities in the southern half of the peninsula. 94 KN-23 short-range ballistic missiles with demonstrated terminal maneuvering capability, targeting the same installation set with a higher precision package. 61 KN-25 multiple rocket artillery systems, providing a saturation layer against fixed defensive positions. 39 Hwasong 7 variants fitted with chemical payloads, routed specifically toward airfield complexes, a capability the KPA had never publicly declared, but which US intelligence had assessed with high confidence since 2021. And 3 KN-23 missiles that carried warheads the intelligence community had classified under a separate designation. The warhead signatures were consistent with a tactical nuclear yield in the 10 to 20 kiloton range. The 3 missiles had been tracked from a separate storage facility through a custody chain that had been under continuous surveillance for 6 days. Their targeting solutions, reconstructed from launch trajectory analysis, pointed toward Camp Humphreys, the consolidated US military hub in Pyeongtaek, housing approximately 36,000 US military personnel and dependents. 3 missiles, 3 trajectories converging on a single installation. The entire US and ROK defensive response would be organized around ensuring none of those 3 trajectories reached their terminal phase. The strategic logic behind the broader launch was not irrational. The KPA's operational assessment had identified a genuine window. The ROK presidential transition had been underway for 11 days, placing the political authorization chain for a US military response in a period of documented institutional turbulence. The KPA's doctrine assumed that a conventional response from the US side would require a minimum of 4 hours of political authorization before strike packages could be executed against North Korean territory. 4 hours during which the initial salvo would have already achieved its intended degradation of US and ROK force concentration points. The flaw in the assessment was the same flaw that had characterized every adversary's model in every scenario. They had modeled the political timeline accurately. They had not modeled what the military system did before the political authorization was needed. The intercept sequence did not require an executive order. The firing solutions were already generated. The Patriot batteries had been in heightened readiness for 9 days. The THAAD battery at Seongju had been in full active sensor mode since 3:47 a.m. when the tunnel door signatures first appeared on the overhead reconnaissance feed. The US and ROK defense was already executing before the first KPA missile had cleared its launch complex. 4:22 a.m. Camp Carroll, South Korea. U.S. Army Air and Missile Defense Command Forward Operations Center. The Missile Defense Alert notification reached the Operations Center at 4:22 a.m., 17 seconds after the first SBIRS thermal signature was confirmed at Buckley Space Force Base. The duty officer, a major with 6 years in the air defense specialty, had been watching the tunnel door activity on his combined intelligence feed since 4:09 a.m., when the unmanned aerial vehicle providing continuous surveillance of 3 known launch complexes had transmitted imagery of simultaneous tunnel entrance activity across all 3 sites. He had requested an elevated alert authorization at 4:11 a.m. It had been granted at 4:14 a.m. His Patriot batteries were already in full active search mode before the first launch plume appeared on his screen. At 4:22 a.m., when the SBIRS notification arrived confirming 37 simultaneous launch signatures in the first 30 seconds, his console showed a number that no air defense officer in history had been asked to process in real time. 37 confirmed inbound tracks, with additional signatures still being correlated, against a battery architecture designed to protect a finite number of aim points. He flagged the 3 KN-23 nuclear-designated tracks as absolute priority intercepts. His console assigned them designations 0001, 0002, and 0003. Everything else was secondary to those 3 numbers. The THAAD battery at Seongju was the first layer against the longer-range Hwasong 7 ballistic missiles. THAAD's hit-to-kill intercept approach was the correct tool for the high-altitude terminal phase of the Hwasong 7's trajectory. The kinetic impactor approach left no functional warhead fragment because there was no explosion, only a direct collision at combined closing velocities exceeding 10 kilometers per second. By 4:29 a.m., THAAD had executed 31 intercepts against the Hwasong 7 package. The fire control system was operating at 96% of theoretical maximum engagement rate. The battery's ready load was being consumed at a rate that the battery commander had already flagged to the operations center. At 4:31 a.m., the THAAD battery reached its ready load threshold. It had expended its preloaded interceptor supply and required a reload cycle. The reload window was 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the THAAD layer was non-functional. The operations center rerouted the remaining Hwasong 7 tracks to the Aegis BMD ships operating in the Yellow Sea and Sea of Japan. 3 Aegis destroyers, networked under the same CEC architecture that had functioned in the Persian Gulf and Philippine Sea scenarios, absorbed the rerouted assignment queue and began generating SM-3 firing solutions against the inbound tracks. The rerouting took 8.3 seconds. The SM-3 engagement geometry against Hwasong 7 targets in the THAAD battery's coverage zone was less favorable than the THAAD intercept geometry. The SM-3 was engaging from a different angle, with reduced closing velocity advantage. Engagement probability per intercept, 71% compared to THAAD's 91%. The system absorbed the degradation and continued. The KN-23 tracks were the critical problem. The KN-23's terminal maneuvering capability placed it in the same difficult intercept category as the DF-17 in the Pacific scenario, a vehicle that did not follow a predictable parabolic arc in its terminal phase that operated at altitudes below the SM-3's optimal engagement envelope and above the PAC-3's most effective range band. The PAC-3 MSE was the designated terminal interceptor, and its engagement probability against a maneuvering KN-23 was modeled at between 58% and 74%, depending on approach geometry. Tracks 0001, 0002, and 0003 were each assigned 3 PAC-3 MSE interceptors as a salvo. Not 1 interceptor per threat, but 3, staggered in timing to account for the possibility of first interceptor miss, and to ensure that if the first 2 missed, A third was still in flight. The salvo approach consumed 9 interceptors against 3 threats. It was not an efficient use of a finite magazine. It was the correct use of a finite magazine when the cost of a miss was incalculable. At 4:33 a.m., Track 0001 entered its terminal phase at an altitude of 28 kilometers above Pyeongtaek, maneuvering 7 degrees off its predicted descent vector. The first PAC-3 in the assigned salvo missed by 41 meters. The second intercepted at 19 kilometers altitude, achieving a direct hit. Track 0001 was neutralized. Track 0002 entered terminal phase at 4:34 a.m. The first PAC-3 in its salvo achieved direct hit at 23 kilometers altitude. Track 0002 was neutralized. Track 0003's first 2 PAC-3 interceptors both missed. The KN-23 had executed a sequence of 3 lateral maneuvers in the terminal phase that the engagement solution had not predicted. At 4:34 a.m., with Track 0003 at 14 kilometers altitude and 47 seconds from its designated impact point, the third PAC-3 in the salvo, the final assigned interceptor, was in flight. The Patriot battery commander at the Camp Humphreys defensive position had been watching the Track 0003 engagement on his console since 4:33 a.m. When the second PAC-3 miss was confirmed and the track continued descending, he had 38 seconds to decide whether to fire additional interceptors from his battery's reserve load against a track that already had 1 interceptor assigned and in flight. His battery's reserve was not unlimited. Every interceptor he committed to Track 0003 was an interceptor unavailable for the 71 other tracks still in his engagement queue. He committed 2 additional interceptors at 4:34 a.m. The third salvo, PAC-3, impacted Track 0003 at 12.4 kilometers altitude, 31 seconds before projected impact. The warhead was classified as neutralized. The 2 additional interceptors he had fired passed through the now clear trajectory without a target. The nuclear designated package had been neutralized. All 3 tracks. The cost: 18 PAC-3 MSE interceptors against 3 threats. An expenditure rate that was not sustainable if the KPA had additional nuclear designated packages in reserve. A question that would not be answered with confidence for the next 14 hours of intelligence analysis. The conventional package was a different category of problem. 412 weapons represented a volume that the combined US-ROK defensive network could engage, absorb, and partially defeat, but not fully defeat. The honest arithmetic of the intercept campaign was that the THAAD reload window, the SM-3 geometry degradation during that window, and the saturation volume of the KN-25 rocket artillery layer meant that a percentage of the conventional package would reach its intended target zones. The question was which percentage and what it hit. The KN-25 multiple rocket artillery was the lowest technology element of the KPA's package and the hardest to intercept at scale. 61 salvos of unguided heavy rockets fired in ripple sequences that created overlapping impact patterns across target zones were not individual tracks with individual intercept solutions. They were area saturation events. The Patriot network wasn't designed to engage unguided rocket artillery at scale. The counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar systems at the targeted installations, the CIWS-derived CRAM batteries positioned specifically for this threat, were the correct tool. Between 4:27 a.m. and 4:41 a.m., CRAM systems at Osan, Camp Humphreys, and Kunsan engaged the KN-25 rocket salvos in their terminal phases. The distinctive sound of a CRAM engagement, a multi-barrel rotary cannon firing at 4,500 rounds per minute, producing a continuous roar rather than individual shots, was audible across Osan's flight line for 11 minutes. Intercept rate against the unguided rocket salvos, 71%. The remaining 29% impacted across the installation areas, primarily in open ground and hardstand areas. One impact on the Osan flight line disabled 2 parked F-16s on the ground. 1 impact near the Camp Humphreys motor pool disabled 4 vehicles. Personnel shelters had been occupied since 4:09 a.m., when the elevated alert was declared. The impacts produced property damage. They did not produce the personnel losses the KPA had modeled. The Hwasong 7 and KN-23 conventional package produced more significant results. Of 312 combined ballistic missiles in the conventional category, 241 were intercepted by the combined THAAD, Aegis BMD, and Patriot network. 71 impacted their designated aim point zones. Of those 71, 18 hit hardened facility structures. The remaining 53 impacted in surrounding areas, parking areas, access roads, 1 communications antenna array at Osan, the runway at Kunsan receiving 2 impacts that degraded its operational status. The 39 chemical payload variants required a different response calculus. The US and ROK command network had been notified of the chemical payload assessment at 4:08 a.m. before the launches. Personnel at targeted installations had been ordered into MOPP-4 protective posture at 4:15 a.m., 7 minutes before the first launch, based on the elevated intelligence assessment. The chemical payloads were assessed to be a blister agent variant. Against personnel already in full protective equipment, occupying hardened shelter positions, the chemical layer's intended effect, forcing the abandonment of airfield operations through contamination of exposed ground crews, did not achieve its modeled outcome. Osan's flight operations were not abandoned. They were delayed by 3 hours while the contaminated flight line areas were assessed and the MOPP protocol was maintained. 3 hours, not the 24 the KPA's model had projected. The Koksan 170mm artillery positions, 340 guns pre-sighted along the DMZ in hardened emplacement caves, each capable of reaching the northern suburbs of Seoul at maximum range, opened fire at 4:31 a.m. This was not a surprise. The guns had been in their emplacement positions since 1994. Their existence was the central fact of any Korean contingency planning. The response to them was equally pre-planned. An immediate counter-battery campaign combining F-16J, Wild Weasel aircraft already airborne on alert, HIMARS mobile rocket artillery positioned south of Seoul with pre-calculated firing solutions, and B-52 Arclight missions with GPS-guided munitions against the cave entrances. The first HIMARS salvos against confirmed Koksan position coordinates were fired at 4:33 a.m. F-16CJ aircraft delivered JDAM against cave entrance coordinates at 4:37 a.m. The first round of counter-battery fire did not silence the Koksan positions. The guns were inside caves, and a cave entrance strike required direct penetration or a sufficiently close detonation to cause structural collapse. Of 34 cave entrance coordinates engaged in the first counter-battery sequence, 11 were assessed as neutralized. 23 remained capable of continued fire. The northern suburbs of Seoul received 847 Koksan rounds between 4:31 a.m. and 5:14 a.m. The period before the counter-battery campaign had degraded the firing rate below operationally significant levels. The rounds impacted in residential and commercial areas in Dobong and Nowon districts. The civilian population in these areas had been under evacuation orders since 4:18 a.m., when the emergency broadcast system activated across the Seoul metropolitan area based on the elevated intelligence assessment forwarded to civil defense authorities. The evacuation was incomplete. It had been in progress for 13 minutes when the first rounds arrived. The U.S. counterstrike against KPA military infrastructure required political authorization. That authorization was received at 5:04 a.m., 42 minutes after first launch. The authorization timeline was not a failure of the political process. It was the political process functioning as designed under genuine time pressure, with genuine uncertainty about the nuclear status of the 3 intercepted KN-23 warheads, with a president who had received a nuclear weapons employment briefing 11 minutes before being asked to authorize strikes on a country that possessed nuclear weapons. 42 minutes. The military had used that time. Operation Granite Veil had been in pre-authorized operational readiness since 4:47 a.m., before the political authorization was received. Not executing strikes, which required authorization. Pre-positioning. Final targeting data uploaded. Strike packages airborne and holding at pre-designated orbit points outside the authorization release line. B-2 Spirit aircraft from Whiteman, already on extended airborne alert, had been holding at their orbit points since 4:51 a.m. Their targets, the 17 tunnel complexes that had been identified as the primary KPA Strategic Launch Infrastructure. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator was the assigned weapon for the hardened tunnel complexes, the only non-nuclear munition assessed to have a probability of penetrating the granite overburden and achieving structural collapse of the tunnel interior. At 5:04 a.m., the authorization was transmitted to the holding aircraft. Strike packages were released from their orbit points simultaneously. By 5:09 a.m., the first JAS SMER from a B-1B Lancer operating at standoff range over the Yellow Sea impacted the surface infrastructure of Launch Complex 7 in North Hwanghae Province. The fuel storage building, the vehicle maintenance facility, the surface communications node. The tunnel entrance was not yet engaged. The surface infrastructure was eliminated as a precursor to the primary strike. The B-2 carrying the primary tunnel package for Launch Complex 7 released its first GBU-57 at 5:17 a.m. The weapon was targeted at the primary tunnel entrance, calculated to penetrate to a depth of approximately 40 meters before detonating. The seismograph at the ROK Meteorological Administration Monitoring Station at Seongju, 180 kilometers south, registered a 2.1 magnitude event. The tunnel complex at Launch Complex 7 had been evacuated of personnel and mobile launch vehicles during the 17-minute window between tunnel door opening and the first counterstrike impact. The GBU-57 impacted an empty tunnel. The structural assessment: entrance collapsed. Interior sections 1 through 4 destroyed. Interior sections 5 through 9, where the rail-mounted TEL platforms were designed to shelter during a strike, required additional assessment. This was the fundamental operational reality of the DPRK target set that differentiated it from every other theater. The KPA had been preparing its underground infrastructure since the 1950s. 7 decades of tunneling had produced a hardened underground military architecture of a depth and complexity that could not be decisively neutralized in a single strike sequence. The B-2 with the GBU-57 was the most capable non-nuclear bunker penetration system in the U.S. inventory. Against a tunnel complex with 340 meters of horizontal depth and multiple branch points, even the GBU-57 could guarantee structural effect only in the sections it directly penetrated. The sections beyond its penetration depth required another weapon, another mission, another assessment cycle. The 60-minute objective was not neutralization of KPA strategic capability. The 60-minute objective was 3 things: intercept the nuclear designated tracks, suppress the Koksan fire rate, and establish the surveillance and targeting picture for the sustained campaign that would follow. All 3 objectives had been achieved, at cost, within the first 60 minutes. By 5:22 a.m., 60 minutes after first launch detection, the operational status was as follows. The 3 nuclear-designated KN-23 tracks had been neutralized. Camp Humphreys was operational. Osan was operational with contaminated areas under MOPP assessment. Kunsan had 2 runway impacts and was operating at reduced capacity. The THAAD battery at Seongju had completed its reload cycle and was back in full engagement mode at 5:02 a.m. The Aegis BMD network in the Yellow Sea and Sea of Japan had expended significant VLS capacity, but remained in engagement posture. The Koksan fire rate had been reduced by 68% from its peak, 11 cave entrances neutralized, 23 remaining, but the counter-battery campaign was still executing. The B-2 strike packages were still in flight. The 17 tunnel complexes had received initial engagement. Structural assessment was pending on all 17. The mobile TEL units that had fired and dispersed, a portion of which had re-entered tunnels before the counterstrike arrived, remained unaccounted for in the current targeting picture. This was the opening 60 minutes of a campaign, not its conclusion. The KPA had not been defeated. Its leadership structure remained intact. Its nuclear arsenal, beyond the 3 tactical warheads that had been committed to the opening strike, remained in hardened storage positions whose precise locations were a matter of ongoing intelligence collection, not confirmed targeting data. What had been achieved in 60 minutes was the prevention of a nuclear event on the Korean peninsula. The 3 warheads that could have changed the nature of the conflict had been intercepted before reaching their targets. The conventional damage was real and was being assessed. The counterstrike was underway against the hardest target set in the world, against an adversary that had spent 7 decades specifically engineering its military infrastructure to survive exactly what was being done to it. The system had performed. The campaign was far from over. Time from first SBIRS launch detection to completion of initial counterstrike sequence. 60 minutes. Adversary weapons launched, 412 total. Ballistic missiles intercepted, 241 of 312, 77.2% intercept rate. Nuclear designated tracks neutralized, 3 of 3, 100%. KN-25 rocket artillery rounds intercepted by CRAM, 71%. Chemical payload variants neutralized in flight, 34 of 39, 87.2%. Physical impacts: Osan Air Base, flight line contamination, 2 F-16 disabled, runway operational. Kunsan Air Base, 2 runway impacts, reduced operational capacity. Camp Humphreys, 0 impacts. Seoul Northern Suburbs, 847 Koksan rounds, civil defense assessment ongoing. Counterstrike munitions deployed through first 60 minutes, 68 JAS SMER, 14 GBU, 57 MOP, 94 JDAM, and small diameter bombs. HIMARS rocket salvos, 312 rounds against Koksan positions. Total counterstrike cost through 60 minutes, approximately $1.9 billion. KPA tunnel complex surface infrastructure assessed as engaged, 17 of 17 primary complexes. Tunnel interior structural confirmation, 11 of 17 pending. Mobile TEL units unaccounted. Estimated 23 vehicles dispersed into tunnel network. Koksan positions suppressed, 11 of 34 confirmed neutralized. 23 remaining in degraded operation. US assets. THAAD battery reload window 11 minutes, now fully operational. PAC-3 MSE interceptors expended against nuclear designated tracks, 18 of available load. Osan F-16 losses, 2 airframes. No U.S. personnel fatalities from direct weapons impact on military installations. The KPA had built its deterrent around a single foundational premise: that the depth of its underground infrastructure would allow it to absorb any conventional strike and continue operating. That premise remained partially valid. What it had not fully accounted for was the depth of the U.S. defensive architecture arrayed against its offensive capability. A layered intercept network that had absorbed 412 weapons and held the critical line at 3 tracks, 3 trajectories, 18 interceptors. The campaign would run for weeks. The decision had been made in seconds.